Welcome back to Classical Mythology. Today we will be beginning Module 8, which over two parts will be examining the imagery, controversy, and legacy of the god Dionysus. Now, the origins of Dionysus are somewhat obscure. In some accounts, he's the son of Zeus and Semele, who is his human mother, while other stories are told of him being born of Zeus and Persephone. So like other deities we've encountered in the course, there are multiple origin stories associated with Dionysus. And according to some accounts, as an infant he is torn apart and his limbs are scattered throughout the world. So once again we have an ominous and violent tone to a origin story, just like we did in the case of Aphrodite. In general, Dionysus is the god of wine, fertility, and especially ecstatic experience. And as we'll see later, he is often paired with Apollo, who is in some ways his antithesis as the god of order, reason, and civilization. And we know that Dionysus was worshipped early on in archaic phases of Greek civilization, both by the Mycenaeans and also in Minoan Crete. In some traditions, Dionysus is a foreign god from the east, from either India or Ethiopia. And in many ways, he is cast as a kind of outsider god and doesn't quite fit within the pantheon more generally. There's also a diversity of imagery associated with Dionysus. Early on, images of Dionysus have him portrayed as an older, bearded man who carries a staff known as a thyrsus, whereas later depictions have him cast as a beardless youth, often with feminine qualities. He is sometimes imagined as returning in triumph from the fringes of the civilized world and leading a procession of female maenads and male satyrs. Moreover, the phallus is an important symbol for the god Dionysus, as we'll see in some of the iconography associated with him. To the Romans, he is also known as Bacchus, and he is seen as a kind of liberator and revealer of knowledge, especially in a religious context, but a knowledge that is discovered through intoxication and ecstatic experience. Now we know of a number of festivals that were celebrated in honor of Dionysus, particularly in the Greek world. At Athens, we have the Anthesteria, which is a spring festival honoring Dionysus and his gift of wine to humanity. This festival is held over 3 days. On day 1, known as the Pythoegia, or the jar opening, jars of wine are opened, as well as funeral urns. The spirits of the dead were thought to be released at this time and allowed to wander through the city. On day 2, known as the Coes, or the wine jugs, drinking contests took place, but people weren't allowed to speak. Revelers then proceeded to the temple of Dionysus outside the city, wearing a special form of funeral mask. On day 3, the Kytroi, or the pots, there was a celebration of the ritual marriage of Dionysus to his consort Ariadne. Dionysus is also present in another important context, the symposium, or the drinking party. This was an important feature of ancient Greek social life, where freeborn males would gather together in private homes, drink large amounts of wine, discuss various political and intellectual topics. There they were entertained by slaves who often also provided sexual services as the male participants engaged in their discussions and debate. One of the most famous depictions of a symposium comes from Plato's dialogues. In his dialogue called the Symposium, we have Socrates and a number of his companions debating various aspects of love and erotic desire. In this setting, wine was seen as the revealer of truth and as a mechanism to remove inhibitions. Dionysus is also closely linked with ancient Greek dramatic poetry. He is the god of masks and costumes and obscene songs. In fact, the performance of Greek drama has its origins in Dionysian festivals, which were originally occasions for groups of singers to perform songs in honor of Dionysus. Over time, a soloist emerged who interacted with the larger chorus and engaged in dialogue, and eventually a second player was added in order to tell a more sophisticated story. So scholars believe that this is at the root of the very unique structure of Greek drama with a very limited number of actors. But it has its origins in a religious festival celebrating this particular god. Dionysus is also associated with the phenomenon of mystery religion. There was an important mystery cult attached to Dionysus that was involved initiation rituals open to anyone in society, either slave or free, male or female. During the ritual, the god is encountered through some sort of ordeal or trial, and the initiation rites generally of Dionysus were known as orgia. The mysteries of Dionysus generated a certain amount of controversy in the city of Rome early in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And we have a interesting account of these mysteries from the Roman author Livy. So we'll look at Livy's account and then try and interpret what's going on in this very unusual description of the Bacchic festival in the city of Rome around 180. Livy's account involves a young man who is being initiated into the rites of Bacchus or Dionysus. As Livy says, the mother told the young man that she had made a vow on his behalf when he was sick, that as soon as he began to recover, she would have him initiated into the Bacchic rites, and that she now wished to discharge the vow, as she was obliged to do by the generosity of the gods. And this is not uncommon in ancient literature, where people make promises to the gods if a loved one is sick or thought to be dying, and then they must act on that vow. Livy continues, he must maintain chastity for 10 days. On the 10th day he would partake of a banquet and be washed with pure water, and then she would conduct him to the sanctuary. Then his mistress, Hispala, told him that while she was a slave, she entered that sanctuary as an attendant to her mistress, but as a free woman she had never gone near it. She knew that it was the workshop of every kind of corruption, and it was well known that for 2 years now no one had been initiated there who was more than 20 years old. So this young man is getting different accounts of what the initiation ritual involves from different persons in his life. As soon as a person was inducted, she said, he was treated as a victim for the priests. They would conduct him to a place which resounded with screeches, chanting, music, and the crash of cymbals and drums, so that the voice of the initiate could not be heard while the shameful act was perpetrated upon him with violence. So here, even though his mother has promised to dedicate the young man to the god Dionysus, uh, he's presented with this allegedly sinister aspect to the ritual. Hispala then expounded to the consul the origin of the rites. At first, that sanctuary belonged to the women, and it was customary not to admit any man. They had 3 days fixed each year in which initiations were held for the Bacchants, that is, the devotees to Dionysus or Bacchus during the day. By custom, the matrons were made priestesses in turn. Pacula Ania of Campania changed everything when she was priestess, in spite of a warning from the gods. She was the first to initiate men, her sons Minius Carinius and Herennius Carinius. Of the daytime rite she made a nocturnal one, and for 3 days each year she established 5 initiation days each month. So this female companion explains that some very significant changes in the protocol of the ritual have taken place under the leadership of this particular priestess, whereby it had previously been only associated with women, celebrated in the daytime. Now men are being initiated and the rites are taking place at night. Also, the frequency has increased from 3 days annually to 5 days each month. So that implies some very kind of radical changes to how this festival is being operated, at least according to Livy's account. As a result, the rites were in a state of promiscuity. Men mingled with women. The night added permissiveness. No crime, no vice was neglected there. There was more debauchery on the part of the men among themselves than with the women. If some were less tolerant of the shame and more reluctant to commit the crime, they were slaughtered as sacrificial victims. To believe that nothing was illicit among them was the most exalted faith. Men, as if their minds had been taken from them, prophesied with frenzied tossings of their bodies. Women in the vestments of Bacchants, hair in disarray, ran down to the Tiber with burning torches, submerged the torches in the water, and because live sulfur and lime were applied to them, brought them out with flames still burning. So we get some sense of the sort of excessive behavior and hedonism associated with the celebration of the Bacchic rites in the city of Rome, according to this informant's account. People were reported to have been carried off by the gods when actually they had been tied to machines which carried them out of sight into hidden caverns. These were the ones who had refused to take the oath, or take part in the crimes, or tolerate the abuse. They were an immense group, and were now almost a second nation. Several men and women of the nobility were among their number. For the last 2 years it had been the policy that no one over the age of 20 be initiated. Those of younger ages could be got hold of and were more tolerant of error and vice. Here we get a description of some of the sort of props that are involved in the ceremony, as well as the increase in numbers of adherents. For Livy here to recount that they were almost a second nation, that's bound to cause concern for authorities. Who don't particularly want people organizing in this sort of way. Now, Livy's account generally is a very negative tone, and he seems very much intent on criticizing and maligning the celebration of the Bacchic mysteries. Now, Romans tolerated a wide range of religious activity as long as it was seen as fairly harmless by their standards. But the Bacchanalia had become a well-established festival in Italy and in Rome itself, and was suddenly declared a threat to the state early in the 2nd century BCE, around 180. Now, why was it cast in this light? Well, some saw it as a kind of criminal conspiracy. Others feared the influence of this foreign god. Remember, Dionysus is viewed to a certain extent as a foreign deity. But ultimately, what authorities sought to dismantle was what was becoming a very organized cultic association. In particular, members of the group crossed social boundaries, whereas most religions tended to reinforce social structures. Participants were invited to abandon those conventions of status and class and even gender roles. And participants were united by their religious affiliation as initiates into the Bacchic rites. So this is a fairly new phenomenon in Roman society for a religious practice to be a marker of social identity. Moreover, the mystery cults in general offered a more personal religious experience as opposed to the public festivals that were practiced annually in the city of Rome. And membership was exclusive, and those members constituted essentially a unique social grouping. In general, any kind of innovation in either the realm of religion or social relations is seen as bad in traditional Roman eyes. So that's part of the reasoning behind restricting or even outlawing the celebration of this festival at the city of Rome. But you might have noticed that in Livy's account we have a number of the sort of stereotypes and tropes that are still associated with kind of illegal or nefarious religious movements, the kind of cult imagery of rampant sexuality, of sacrifice, of murder. These are all the sorts of accusations that are leveled against religious organizations and groups that society views as dangerous. And in fact, in some of these groups we do have examples of violence and even murder in some of the most extreme cases, but there is a kind of typical rhetoric associated with religious organizations that are seen as threatening to society, and much of this imagery goes back to the Romans themselves. Now, in part 2 of the module, we will look at a sort of different account of the Dionysian initiation ritual, as well as the reception of Dionysus in later time periods and cultural traditions.